Thank you. And this is going to be a discussion of the 2021 LERA Research Volume titled Revaluing Workers Toward a Democratic and Sustainable Future. Presenters include Tobias Schulze-Cleven and Todd Vachon, who co-edited the volume. Both are faculty at Rutgers University in the School of Management and Labor Relations. Saul Rubinstein and Michelle Van Noy, both also from Similar, will present papers related to their essays in the volume. Then Virginia Doellgast of Cornell University and Martin Krzywdzinski from the Berlin Social Science Center will offer their comments and implications of the research volume. I'll do my best to keep us on time, and we'll save time at the end for a short question and answer period. Please post your questions as they occur in the chat, and we will address them after the discussants' remarks. So I'll turn it over to Toby and Todd.
Thank you. Let me see. Does that work? You probably can see it, but you probably cannot see the whole presentation. Now you can see the whole presentation. Does it work like that? Like that?
Looks good.
Okay, good. So that's the title page, the book cover, I guess, once it comes out soon. So we keep it very brief. I just want to tell you the agenda of the volume, of some of the arguments we make, and then we briefly go over the table of contents. So the book is really an attempt by Todd and me and all the contributors to present a labor studies perspective on the debate about the future of work. That debate, we believe, has certain biases, and we try to address them. As we lay out, we define labor studies as, I don't know, that's the right word, characterized maybe by three features. That is a focus on worker struggles, an interdisciplinary lens, and a commitment to the dignity of work and workers. That is, we could say, an explicit normative commitment. In contrast to much of the debate, we do, at least we think, in contrast to much of the current debate, we do take on the current crises in which societies around the world face themselves, and we characterize them as economic, political, and environmental. One could also say social, but I think that falls under those categories. And with focusing on these crises, we take a critical stance toward the overly deterministic flavor of many of the current contributions. We think overly deterministic, particularly with respect to the impact of technology and the role of market forces. And as we put together this volume, we did want to highlight a lot of the work done at Similar, but not just at Similar, also around Similar. This is obviously the research volume for the Labor and Employment Relations Association. We also want to explore how labor studies as a field fits within or relates to labor and employment relations. I personally have been somewhat of I have not been involved in the historical development of these fields. Some people in LERA have. And so it was quite interesting I think, for both Todd and me as editors to trace the relationship of the two fields and how they have come closer together, I would actually say, more recently. We make three arguments that really try to pull together the content of the book. As expressed in the title, we do think that the revaluation of work, that is the effort and contributions of workers, are crucial to realizing the promises of democracy and improving sustainability. Moreover, we make two arguments. That is that collective political action, and particularly the collective agency of workers, is central to pushing and driving this agenda forward. We also focus on reproductive work because we think reproductive work, that is the labor efforts from care to education that sustain the reproduction of society, that these labor efforts can function as a crucible of innovation for the valuation and governance of work more broadly. While under COVID, we have seen a bit more attention to reproductive work, and we now see the inclusion of care work in the infrastructure bill that is before Congress. In the future of work debate, it has long been, or had long been, really only an afterthought. And we really think it should be central to talking about the future possibilities, and collective action in creating the future. So Todd, you wanted to talk from here on, I believe.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Toby. So I'm just going to give a quick, kind of run through the table of contents to give you the flavor of what the volume as a whole looks like before we get really kind of into the more focused piece today. As you can see in this abridged image of the table of contents, the book's organized into an introductory section, 3 substantive sections, and a conclusion. In the introductory chapter, Toby and I lay out the main arguments, which Toby just elaborated here. In chapter 2, Toby's chapter really reviews the advantages of labor studies for understanding and shaping the future of work. And kind of the main thrust here is adding a much needed new intellectual direction to challenge the market fundamentalism that has really dominated discussions about the future of work. And this chapter lays out the core arguments of the book in the 3 pieces that follow: revaluing work, workers' collective agency, and innovations in reproductive work, which are, the next 3 sections. So part 1 is the articulating the labor studies perspective. This explores the elements of labor studies on the future of work, including input from the various disciplines that contributed to labor studies, with a focus on labor worker voice and placing revaluation within the context of climate change. Part 2, the evolving forms of collective agency, zeroes in on the role of workers' collective agency in shaping the evolving world of work. And part 3, reproductive work as a crucible of innovation, investigates how such collective agency has produced innovation in labor processes that help reproduce and sustain society, with a particular focus on domestic work and education, which is the area of focus for today's panel. And then in the concluding chapter, Toby really takes stock of the book as a product of the contemporary American academy. And unlike a typical conclusion that just summarizes what's found, we really kind of go forward and apply it and argue that the 3 constitutive features of labor studies that we elaborate in the volume can illuminate the steps that are needed for realizing the innovations that higher education can make to support the revaluation agenda. All right, next slide, please. So this is part 1. You can see the chapters here. Chapter 3, Michael Merrill and Dorothy Sue Cobble give us a historical perspective on technological disruption that kind of compares the scale and effects of the current labor market disruption to 3 previous transformations: colonization, commercialization, industrialization. Chapter 4 by Todd Rutherford extends the critique of technological determinism by deploying a geographer's perspective to examine the differentiated adoption of Industry 4.0 technology across 3 countries: Germany, Italy, and the US. And in chapter 5, Mijin Cha and I focus on societal level adjustments related to climate change. And we explore 3 cases of recent socio-ecological transitions in order to consider what the ingredients are for and the prospects are for a just transition for workers and communities. Next slide, please. All right, so in this next section, Naomi Williams, our moderator today, and Cherie Davis open up part 2 with their chapter 6 by using a critical race theory and intersectionality lens to examine key moments within US history when workers managed to shape the political landscape and expand democracy, critically reassessing the tendency of the dominant historical narrative to treat the struggle for civil rights and worker activism as separate processes of contention. The authors emphasize the vital role of Black workers in building interracial coalitions. And we might even say that this chapter is kind of a little foreshadowing of what next year's volume is going to get into in much greater detail, which I'm really excited to see come to fruition. Chapter 7 by Joel Yudkin and David Jacobs continues the push against technological determinism by exploring various mechanisms through which worker voice can be expanded. And in particular, they elaborate a contemporary model of craft work, or recrafting of work, to guide labor strategy on technology. Chapter 8, Joseph McCartan, Erica Smiley, and Marilyn Snyderman engage with 2 focal areas of innovation in organizing collective worker voice. And those are sectoral bargaining and bargaining for the common good. In this chapter, the authors consider the range of possibilities that could emerge from an effort to combine the broadening impulses of sectoral bargaining along with the deepening impulses of bargaining for the common good. And then the final chapter in this section, yes?
You are speed up. You're 2 minutes over time.
Okay, chapter 9 is Victor and Bob discuss the role of labor education. And the big argument here is that the erosion of traditional labor relations over recent years has made it more important for labor education programs to focus on structural change and issues of race, class, and gender, just as much as the mechanical tools classes. And chapter 7, I'll throw it back to you, Toby. Slide 7, rather.
No, that's the last part. It's on reproductive work, and that's the presentations today, 2 of the 4 chapters. You can read what the other 2 are. I think we'll start with Saul and then move on to Michelle. I'll leave it at that. I think Saul, you can start. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna try to share my screen and put it into slide mode. So is that working? Can you see the slide?
Perfect. Yes. Thank you, Saul.
Okay, great. So then let me just start by thanking Toby and Todd for editing this volume and for all their encouragement and support. And I want to thank Naomi for sharing this session and for all of you attending. As I understand, my task today is to just give you a bit of an overview about what's in the chapter that John McCarthy, my co-author, and I put together. Essentially, the chapter takes a look first at the history of neoliberal approaches to public school reform, and then argues that those approaches over the past 40 years have not produced the promised results. We then offer up an alternative that's really rooted in our field of industrial relations, and I'll talk more about that and look at the implications of that approach based on research we have done and looking at impacts for students, teachers, particularly in areas of high poverty, and what does it mean? What are the implications for unions? And then we talk about putting theory into practice and looking at New Jersey as a laboratory of democracy and an effort to try to apply that research. So let me just start with, did I lose? Seem to have lost. We okay?
You're back.
I'm back. I don't know what happened there. Let me start with just looking at this question of education policy, and particularly a neoliberal education policy. For the past 40 years, it's been largely agreement between Democrats and Republicans over 6 administrations, from Reagan to Trump, that the best way to improve U.S. public education is by using free market reforms. Charters, vouchers, privatization, in other words, to take market forces as a way to discipline public schools. They also connected it to mass production managerial principles, a horizontal division of labor that applied standardization to teachers as professionals, and a vertical division of labor that separated out the thinking of administration from the implementation of teachers and staff. This intensified during the first the Bush and then the Obama administration through 2 national programs. The first, No Child Left Behind, under the Bush administration, and then Race to the Top under the Obama administration, that expanded yearly testing, put in place punitive consequences, interventions, firings, and takeovers of schools if performance was not satisfactory. It also employed a process called value-added assessments, where teachers were evaluated based on performance by their students on standardized tests, and mandated expansions of both charters and vouchers. These neoliberal reforms essentially expanded the role of markets, minimized the role of the state. Why am I unable to? Race to the Top is particularly interesting. It was a competition set up by Arnold Duncan, who is President Obama's Secretary of Education, for the United States to compete for $4.3 billion in funding. It happened just at the height of the recession, 2008, 2009. And in order to get a share of this money, which everyone was desperate for, you had to agree, your state had to agree to an expansion of market solutions, charters, vouchers, and privatization. You had to agree to adopt teacher evaluation policies. And 34 states, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, modified state education laws or policies to comply 46 states and DC put together plans. Only 18 states receive funding. So with less than 1% of the annual spending, Arnold Duncan was able to change policies in the majority of states across the country. The problem is the results that were promised didn't pan out. NAEP scores, a National Assessment of Educational Progress, those scores have been flat for 40 years. Research on charters by many people, particularly the folks out of Stanford, show that on average they're no better than public schools. Turns out vouchers are worse. The US Department of Education used its own evaluation process and found that its own program showed no impact on student test scores. RAND Corporation said the value-added assessments that were funded by many private sector corporations and foundations like Gates showed no impact on teaching or achievement, yet there were huge costs based on the cost of testing, school closures, curriculum materials and evaluations, and a subsequent demoralization of teachers in the profession. They're leaving at a rate that's unprecedented. So we, over the last 10 years, John McCarthy and I have taken a look at an alternative of public school reform that's based on district and school level partnerships between administration and teachers unions that empower greater collaboration within buildings, elevating teacher voice, sharing decision-making, alignment of goals, with innovation coming from within districts with a focus on teaching and learning. It's had a long history in the private sector. Many folks at LERA have studied this. Let me just quickly share some national performance data with you that include 450 schools across 6 states. If you take a look here at the relationship between percentage of students testing at or above standard in English language arts against collaboration, we show holding all of the factors constant, including poverty, an additional 12.5% of students testing at or above standard. We have similar results in math. We then ask the question, how do you get that collaboration? And we find that as you increase the strength of partnerships between unions and administration and school boards, collaboration increases. We also looked at turnover, and we found that turnover is much higher in high poverty schools than in wealthier schools. But if you increase collaboration in the building, the negative impact of poverty on teacher turnover completely disappears. Same thing happens when you take a look at teacher commitment to staying in the profession. We also found that in these strong partnership districts, the nature of the union leadership changes from being focused extensively around bargaining and grievance issues to also adding in elevating teacher voice in decision-making, in school improvement within your building and across the district. So the union fundamentally changes how it views its responsibility. So I'm worried about running out of time. Our findings showed that partnerships led to greater collaboration that improved performance. It reduced the negative impact on teacher turnover, increased attractiveness in schools, and changed the roles of union leaders. This then led in New Jersey to Rutgers hosted a meeting on this research, and we brought in the leadership of the 2 teachers unions, the AFT in New Jersey and New Jersey Education Association, along with the New Jersey School Boards Association, New Jersey Association of School Administrators, who are the superintendents, and the Principals and Supervisors Association. And they decided 8 years ago to put together what they call the New Jersey Public School Labor Management Collaborative to try to expand this work in practice across New Jersey districts, hoping to get a critical mass of 60 districts within the next couple of years. To date, we're 1/3 of the way there with 23 districts, 128 schools, 450 administrators, 7,600 teachers, and 77,000 students. We hope to add another 6 to 8 districts in the coming year. We've been slowed down by COVID, but we haven't been stopped. And so we hope to expand that work. And it is now being looked at as a national model, with the state being what Justice Louis Brandeis called a laboratory of democracy, where experimentation can take place. We've just received a substantial amount of funding to try to make New Jersey this kind of a laboratory or incubator. And so what have we concluded from this? And you can read more about it in the chapter, but that partnerships is a viable alternative to the neoliberal policies of the past. it is a focus here that I think LERA will appreciate it. It's an institutional and multi-stakeholder approach that focuses on organizational systems and industrial relations, elevating the voice and elevating democracy. I've been impressed that compared to other industries, public education is rooted in democracy, as public is a strongly unionized sector, and unions are the democratic representation of the voice of teachers, and school boards who run these districts are elected from the public at large. Union roles have changed, and we can talk more about that. And also, this chapter and this research tries to fill a gap. We have other scholars who have looked at the relationship, the positive relationship between collaboration and student achievement, but very little has been done on how you establish that kind of collaboration and those kinds of industrial relations. And we think that these partnerships are a way to fill in the scholarly gap in that research. And so I invite you to ask any questions you'd like and to take a closer look at the chapter. And I have finished with 30 seconds to spare. So Naomi, I hope you're happy.
Thank you very much, Saul. Really appreciate that. And anybody, if you have questions for Saul, please feel free to put them in the chat. And Michelle, I turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Naomi, and thank you, Toby and Todd, for including us in this panel today. I'm going to present on our chapter I worked on with Alysa, Hannon, and Heather McKay. We all very equally contributed to this and in putting together our ideas and thoughts about how education and training can be more of a tool of worker empowerment, given all the changes that workers are experiencing right now, and all the attention to what to do with the displaced workers who are experiencing all these changes when they're actually on the ground trying to figure out what's next. And employment, education and training is often a tool that is offered up to help them, but how can we do that in a way that's actually empowering and helpful to workers rather than just perpetuating their losses. So we tried to keep our slides short so we don't go over, and at least if I can get to the next one here. That is really odd, it's not letting me move to the next slide.
Heather, Michelle, try the arrows that you might find on the screen. That's what I had to do.
Oh, okay. All right, so I'm gonna talk to, this is our sort of outline for today. We are, and also for the chapter, we spent a fair amount of the chapter in the beginning just kind of giving context, placing the US sort of skills development system in the context of our liberal market economy of the US, and kind of placing that in the context of other economies and why we have the sort of system that we do and how that operates and what that allows us to think about and to do in this context of the skills debate. And then we talk about a few different ways to promote skills development for workers through the role of the state, the role of labor unions, and also the role of educational institutions. So what we do is kind of review a variety of different practices that are out there that can be used to promote the worker perspective if used in the right way. So I think it's really just a matter of how we apply these tools. So just on the issue of context here, I think a lot of times skills development gets framed in a way that's actually not particularly empowering to workers. It's a sort of a reason why workers are unemployed or why wages are low is because they're lacking skills. So it sort of becomes the sort of the blame game about, we're lacking skills. On the other hand, we can also look at skills development as a tool to empower workers. And so it really depends on how we think about it. And I think we have to recognize that in any sort of skills development system, we are actually balancing different political agendas here. And so sometimes the sort of power imbalance goes much more towards employers than workers, but it doesn't have to be that way because it's really a dynamic balance between the interests of workers, employers, and the labor market. And that's where things get out of balance. But I think we can take a perspective that does empower workers. So I think that's sort of a premise that we start here, recognizing that in the US system, a lot of the onus for skills development is placed on workers. So that balance does sometimes, it is certainly out of whack many times, but we have the challenges. We don't have the sort of regulatory structure that other countries do. And we have a very fragmented sort of skills development system that doesn't necessarily always elevate the interests of workers. And so there has to be intentionality coming out of the system and coming out of political actors here to elevate the interests of workers. So it's sort of not inherently part of our system, but it can be. And so I think what we're looking at is, from the work that we've done in our review of the literature, we've seen some on the ground practice that really does show us that it is possible to empower workers even in our context. And so it's a matter about thinking very intentionally about the strategies that are used and how they balance worker needs and elevate them to empower workers. So I'm going to go through a few of these different examples, and we can, Heather and Alysa can really help me and expand more on that in the Q&A, but I'll just quickly run through a few of those to give you a flavor for what we were looking at. In some cases, we see different strategies that come out of the state and require a little bit, can involve regulation that can promote the interests of workers when we're thinking about skills development. Sector strategies is one way of kind of coordinating firms and actors within a region and sort of thinking differently about firms and their competitive advantage and kind of trying to coordinate efforts towards skills development across the sector. And so it's kind of taking, instead of firm against firm, you're thinking and you're thinking about the wider interests of an economy, including workers. And so it's thinking more about what firms can do to invest in their labor market to promote the overall skills level of everybody, with the idea that it helps all employers and all workers. And so that's one of the things, that's sort of this higher level of coordination. When a region can achieve that, it can lead to much more valuable skills development, because you're looking at sort of more industry-wide kind of transferable skills that allow workers to move from firm to firm more easily, rather than having very specific skills which can tie a worker down to a firm. And this sort of elevates, again, the sort of worker power of being able to have these more transferable skills. And so also bringing in schools and kind of aligning everybody together around sort of a sector. So that's one way that we can see sort of a whole region kind of pushing towards a higher level of skill development that can be more beneficial to workers. We also see increasing numbers of initiatives around job quality. And so, including the education and training system, and thinking about how these can complement traditional initiatives that just focus on skills only. And so we see some of those occurring within firms, within high performance work systems, and sort of as a way of, again, investing more in workers and skill development, and also just improving job quality as part of that. And sort of looking in the labor market to within certain industries and occupation, again, to promote better jobs. And then certainly recognizing the important role of the state in part of those, as part of those initiatives, and improving worker protections and standards and certainly wages, but those kind of coupled with skill development initiatives. And thinking, so part of it is kind of moving, is not just looking only at skills development, but kind of looking at it as part of broader initiatives around sort of coordinating around sectors or around job quality. And so thinking about all those things holistically is part of the key here. Another place certainly where there's an important role for education and training is all the work that unions have been doing around union training funds, building on sort of the traditional role of apprenticeships, which have been very important, but also moving beyond that too, in terms of new unionism that's sort of focusing on bringing in more actors into this, and thinking about working to build career ladders within occupations, and helping more populations that have been previously disadvantaged to be pulled in to more of education and training programs that help people get into careers, and just sort of building up the union ranks in general, flowing in through training funds. And so it's sort of thinking about how to bolster all the traditional methods that unions have had for education and training, and also thinking about building new ones that really focus on career ladders and these pathways in for a very inclusive group of people. So there's certainly a lot to be done to build on there. And then finally, within educational institutions, there's a lot of things that are going on right now that really, when we look at them, they're really about thinking about how we can improve the education and training system to better help workers have more power here. One of them is around credentialing. There's a lot of work going on around credentialing to build credentials that are more transferable for workers, that better represent skills, that are more transparent, and that actually ensure quality. It's sort of more of a consumer protection piece here. There's so many credentials out there that workers don't even know what they're getting. And so part of these efforts are to really make sure that credentials that workers attain actually have meaning and have value and can be transferable across different settings, both in the workplace and within the education system. And then finally, there's a whole vast array of reform efforts that we just begin to scratch the surface of in the chapter that are systemically trying to reform education to give more equitable access to people, to workers in terms of accessing and completing effectively educational programs and sort of helping to navigate the many options that there are, and really just getting to the point of getting valuable education and training, and to focus more on the learner and in their success and what their goals are. So I think throughout all of the efforts that we've looked at, there's really a need for all institutions to kind of look at what they can do to make sure that the learner, the worker interests are really kind of at the core and at the fore, and not drowned out by other interests. And so I think, concluding thoughts here from the work and the review that we've done is really that skills development can and should be used as a tool for worker empowerment. So kind of countering this idea that, lack of skills is sort of used to be as part of the blame game, to say, well, that might be a narrative that's out there, but it's not necessarily what skills development is about. Skills development can actually be helpful and can and should and is helpful for workers. But part of it is kind of marshaling collective efforts at a local level, at a state level, that can promote and elevate worker interests. So, we see a lot of debates about, which occupation should receive funding for education and training, low wage, high wage, how do we ensure job quality, how do we do all these things well? And I think that's part of the terrain that we're trying to map out, is to really understand better what's going on there. So, clearly we know there's some promising practices out there, but we definitely believe that there's more research to be done in terms of really understanding how these strategies can really affect workers over the long term, especially with all the things that are going on right now, and possibly a lot more money coming out of the federal government investing in these kinds of programs. How can we make sure that the millions of dollars will be used effectively and will actually help workers, and won't just be turning out needless training that's not really helpful to people? So we are thinking long and hard about that, and look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you, Michelle. Also right on time, really appreciate that. And I will turn it over to Jenny to start our discussant remarks. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the authors for inviting me to give comments on this book. It was really a pleasure to read. I think unusual for LERA Research Volumes, it covers a wide range of sectors and topics. This might be one of the most sort of wide-ranging and diverse LERA Research Volumes I've read. And it's really organized around articulating this labor studies approach to studying and building a worker-centered future of work, which Tobias and Todd just explained. So I think three strengths really stood out for me as I was reading these chapters. The first is that they all ground their discussion of current developments in history, and that shouldn't be so remarkable in industrial relations or employment relations or here labor studies, but it kind of is. And I think it allowed the authors to really show that the crises or challenges that workers and unions face today are not always as radically new as often argued. And it also lets the authors put the interaction between structure and agency front and center. You see them kind of grappling with that in all of the chapters throughout the volume. So for example, the chapters by Merrill and Cobble and by Yudkin and Jacobs give different historical perspectives on both past trends of labor market disruption and labor's response to technological change today. And I particularly liked reading Devenot's and Bruno's history of US labor education programs in the US. So I worked for an environmental justice group in Appalachia in the 1990s that had links to the Highlander Center, which is talked about in the chapter. So I found this kind of personal connection to my own path toward being a labor scholar. And a lot of these have that kind of, nice dynamic between thinking about history and connecting it to what is different or what is the same today in these different areas. A second strength of the book is that race, racism, and racial justice are front and center in several of the chapters, and at least not ignored in most of them. Again, it's kind of a break with some of our past practice in labor and employment relations and LERA research volumes. Williams and Davis Faulkner, they take the lead here, using a critical race theory and intersectionality lens. And they argue that interracial coalitions explain those moments in US history when workers succeed in movements for redistribution and economic justice. So again, connecting some of that history with thinking about possibilities today, as well as the potential weaknesses or reasons, analyses for why labor is failing or having trouble in the current moment. And a third strength, I mean, coming off of that, which I think is connected to the first two that I've just mentioned, is that the chapters are all contextualizing specific cases in broader political and ideological trends, particularly in the rise of neoliberalism. So I did a quick search and found 60 mentions of neoliberal and 39 of neoliberalism, which I'm sure is a record for LERA research volumes. So for example, as we just heard, Rubinstein and McCarthy are discussing neoliberal governance in secondary education. They contrast that with collaborative school reform. And some chapters are taking this to the international level, situating developments in the US with analysis of how it's particularly liberal or neoliberal institutions have weakened worker power. So for example, Hannon, McKay, and Van Noy do this for education and training, as we just saw in their presentation. And McCartan, Smiley, and Snyderman do this for collective bargaining. So both groups of authors see European models of more coordinated training, the first case, or sectoral bargaining in the second, as potential alternatives for the US, but also models or ways of showing that there are the kind of structural agency-based reasons for maybe hope for the US, and seeing this as not the only path or the only way. Rutherford has the most directly comparative chapter, looking at negotiation over adoption of Industry 4.0 in Germany, Italy, and the US. And I think here his more direct empirical comparison points more to similarities connected to weakening worker power than differences, as he's describing this kind of spread of neoliberalism or weakening power across the three countries. So now I'm going to turn to two main questions or reflections on the theme of the book, themes in the book for the questions for the editors and the authors perhaps to engage with. And the first question concerns the relationship between the labor studies approach in this book and the labor and employment relations field. So in chapter 2, Tobias writes, in its normative orientation toward advancing industrial justice, labor studies sets itself apart from the neighboring field of industrial relations, which focused more on functional cooperation across the class divide and remained dominated by institutional economists. So he then goes on to discuss cross-national comparative and global research on labor movements and labor politics as global labor studies. And I think across the chapters, you see, occasionally this reference, like we're outlining a labor studies approach. This is not industrial relations. This is not the way that, our field this other field has looked at unions and collective bargaining, and lays out what's distinctive about that. So I'd like to hear from the authors in the discussion here, what you see as the main similarities or differences between this approach and the focus of researchers like me and institutions like LERA who self-identify more with this evolving field that used to be industrial relations, is now self-describing as labor and employment relations or international and comparative employment relations. I spent 10 years in the UK and something like 2 years in Germany. And in both of those countries, industrial relations or industrielle Beziehungen is really seen as multidisciplinary fields. They have strong roots in sociology and political science. Certainly there are a lot of self-identified industrial relations colleagues in the UK who saw themselves as Marxists or labor process theorists. And got into lively debates with people who kind of tending more toward HR studies or studying social partnership oriented forms of industrial relations. And I think even in the US, the employment relations field has come to look a lot more like how you describe labor studies. So I'm wondering, does this represent convergence, or maybe it suggests we need to pay more attention to our own history and real divides within our field, for example, in perspectives, assumptions, and research approach. So that's kind of question one. And then my second question follows from this one. And I saw across the chapters these two factors that kept coming up as really central to what you see as the worker-centered and worker-led future of work. On the one hand, there was this strong focus on labor market collective bargaining institutions, particularly those supporting redistribution and deepened democracy or voice at work, and really seeing sort of institutional solutions that did involve some compromise between labor and management. And then on the other hand, these initiatives to support a more radical pro-worker mobilization and really to develop a kind of ideology and identification underpinning this. So I'm curious here to hear how the authors of the book see this relationship, right, between, on the one hand, strengthening formal institutions, which often requires some compromise and collaboration with capital, and then on the other hand, more radical organizing and political action from below, which leans on, for example, the kind of labor education Devenants and Bruno describe, with this focus on social transformation, on social justice, and really on more radical political action. History, I think, shows that the first often needs the second to convince capital to collaborate or to compromise. But this move back to the future to more radical political education and organizing is leading to these real splits in the labor movement in the US, certainly in the US Democratic Party. A lot of this discussion of, both the potential, the possibilities, but also the challenges of a much more divided left, as described here. So I was just wondering, is there potentially a different answer to this question that labor studies scholars might give from more traditional, perhaps pluralist or institutional economics influenced employment relations researchers? Maybe this kind of divide or split really points to where your framework can be articulated as a different one, or at least something within this broader house of labor and employment relations that marks you off as being different and contributing to contemporary politics. So thanks again for asking me to have a close read in this book. It's a really comprehensive tour through past and current developments in US labor relations, and should definitely be widely read and cited.
Thank you, Jenny, for those wonderful comments and great questions. And I'll pass it over to Martin.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in the discussion here today. And please excuse me if I'm a little bit maybe confused. It's quite late actually already in Germany, but I try to do my best. And actually I was quite glad when Tobias asked me to comment on the book, because also it meant I could read it before it was going to be published. So this was a pleasure. I also think that with its focus on very fundamental questions about the revaluation of work and workers, about securing a democratic future for the world of work, it addresses very important issues, which of course are lacking in the current discussion. Also in the discussion we have here in Germany on technology, on Industry 4.0, which is dominated often by dystopic scenarios about the loss of jobs. And when we discuss about alternatives, this always or all too often has a very narrow focus on how can we secure jobs, how can we get people back to work. And so sometimes we miss discussions or contributions which aim at this or at getting into how we can create really good jobs in a democratic world of work. Yeah, so I think this is a great contribution by the book, edited by Tobias and Todd, and very important. And I have to admit, I asked a little bit myself, how should I comment on it? Because it's so broad, it has such high diversity of contributions. And I finally decided to take up a point that I consider a strength of the book, on the one hand, but also a point worth of controversy and discussion. And could you give me a and in doing so, I will refer to the overarching framing of the book and to two specific contributions. Yeah, knowing well that I will not be able to do justice to the richness of the book. So I think what was striking to me was really to see this general framework, which is characterized by a decidedly normative perspective, which is shared really by all contributions of the book, and which justifies the contribution of labor studies to the discussions in the political and academic realm in the following way. So it argues labor studies take the perspective of workers, they bring the workers' voice into political and academic debates, and focus primarily on the ways in which the collective organization and mobilization of workers can bring about improvements in the world of work. I think Tobias chapter makes this framing very explicit, but it is also emphasized in a lot of, I think in most chapters. And this is right. I think pursuing such an explicitly normative scientific program is an important counterpoint to the current discussions. But given that my mission is not only to praise the book, but also to give an impulse for discussion, I would like to ask where the limits of such a strong orientation towards a normative perspective are. And if we do not need sometimes a little bit more analytical perspective also on the changing composition of workers, of the workforce, about differentiations in the labor force in today's social structure, the drivers of such differentiations. And these questions are certainly addressed by some contributions in the book. But I think if we want to develop the arguments of the book further, we need to strengthen this point. And I would just like to briefly illustrate it, referring to two contributions in the book, which attracted my attention because they're linked to discussions we have in Germany. And the first example is the chapter Climate Change and the Future of Workers by J. Meijin Cha and Todd Vachon. And it's a wonderful chapter that reviews various examples of worker participation in shaping structural change, and it makes the case for inclusion of workers in these processes. It advocates, which of course everybody would share, the need for protective mechanisms for workers in communities and sectors undergoing transition. And also what I liked, what was interesting was this Just Transition Listening project mentioned by the authors, which wants to use testimonies of workers experiencing structural change to inform policymaking. So this is fascinating. But I have to admit, I missed a little bit an analytical perspective on the impact of transitions on different groups of workers and on social conflict, including within the workforce. So just very briefly, in Germany, we have currently huge discussions in the automotive industry, which is undergoing structural transformation from the combustion engine to electric vehicles, from a Germany-centered production network to a more low-wage country, including a production network. And all this is creating a differentiated landscape of winners and losers. So on the one hand, let's say when we think about this combustion engine thing, we have suppliers of engine parts with massive job cuts. And of course, there is a great pressure on the metal workers union to resist a transition to electric mobility, to protect employment. And while the IG Metall is fighting for securing these workers, actually, it's adopting a strategy which supports rapid transition, also against some interests and some strong workers' voice. Because of climate change, which is self-evident, but also because it sees that it's important for the competitiveness of the German automotive industry. And we could collect similar examples. I think what we see here that a workers' organization is facing a very differentiated workforce with different interests, and the question which strategy should be developed cannot be simply oriented to listening to the workers' voice, or at least it's not so evident to which workers' voice you should listen. So what I want to say, a normative perspective is important, but only the beginning. And we need a theory of structural change in the world of work, which allows to analyze dynamics, conflicts, structural trade-offs. And I will only touch briefly on my second example and then end on this really fascinating chapter by Joel Judkin and David Jacobs on their recrafting perspective on technological change. And when they talk about the craft model, they describe it as the integration of conception and execution, the control of workers over the production process, a high importance of skills and expertise. Of course, this makes sense. I agree that the model is an important normative reference. But when we look how then the authors describe the recrafting agenda, they focus on strengthening the workers' voice, which means strengthening collective bargaining, expanding worker involvement, and very few paragraphs calling a little bit abstractly for skill-based automation. And once again, I think what we need here is a stronger discussion. What are the structural constraints, dynamics of the process? So I have to admit, personally, I don't think that the move to highly specialized division of labor within factories, within global value chains is reversible. I don't think it. I also think that a number of elements of modern lean production concepts will remain indispensable for the future. So in view of this situation, labor studies must go beyond normative concepts of craft work and answer the question, how can skilled work look like under these modern mass production conditions? Due to time constraints, also my need for a glass of wine, I will not elaborate on my responses to this question. I think there are a lot of topics in the book I could link to. I just want also to praise this chapter by Todd Rutherford for this comparative perspective, because I think this is an important step to get into this analysis of structural conditions, which I mentioned. And there are other chapters. I think also the presentations we heard just now link the analysis to a more to a more structural analysis of contemporary capitalism. But I wished some chapters were more explicit in their theories of capitalism and structural change. And I think this would be an important or a good way to bring the arguments of the book forward. Thank you very much. I hope I was not too long. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. And
thank you very much. Those are great comments and thoughts. And I'll open it up to the editors and the authors to respond. We don't have any questions yet in the chat. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand or throw it in the chat. But let's just give the authors and the editors a time to respond to Jenny and Martin.
Todd,
you can go first, Toby.
Okay, I go start. Okay, so thanks to all, including the contributors, for participating in this research volume. Ginny asked about how I see labor studies, or how we see labor studies relating to employment relations, a field that is rapidly changing. Well, this was really the motivating question behind the book. I mean, it was really a book to puzzle through labor studies for me. I can still consider myself new after a decade to this field. Certainly had never taken a class in either labor and employment relations or labor studies. So the quotation that you refer to on how labor studies conceived of itself, that is a quotation from the 1970s, from when it really started, or like maybe even the late 1960s, when the various studies fields were created in the US because various populations thought that they didn't have a voice in the disciplines of the day. So we see the birth of Black studies, Chicano studies, and labor studies, and all focusing on different structural features of social organization. And at that point, labor studies was very much conceived of in opposition to labor and employment, or industrial relations at that point. So I think it's an open question for how much the fields have become more similar. I kind of dropped a hint that I think there's more integration happening. I personally, just as you, I work on comparative topics, and often more into the realm of political science. So I'm really more of a consumer of particularly what the forefront in US domestic politics or US domestic labor studies, employment relations is. But having looked at the special issue that you edited of ILR Review, and that is, I think, freshly out now, I wish that we had produced this book maybe a couple years earlier so that we could have spelled some of that out. But my graduate students are thinking through that, I would say, in terms of what the relationships are and what is distinct or could be distinct for the labor studies perspective within labor and employment relations. And I wholeheartedly agree with what Martin says in terms of becoming more precise and embracing the existence of tensions and distributional conflicts among workers. We didn't stress them as much because we wanted to have a broad tent and not to weaken our arguments too much or to hedge them too much. I think there's a lot of emphasis already on, the perceived zero-sum trade-offs between structurally defined group A and structurally defined group B. And we wanted to emphasize that these groups, that the boundaries are more porous and that there actually might be joint interests. So that was our focus. It does not mean, of course, that these joint interests are easily seen, and I think they need to be constructed, and they need to be constructed in the face of tension. So this is not to say that we don't see them. And I agree with you that better specifying them are good. It's a good agenda for next steps. And I'm actually very glad that some folks in our department and around the department and within LERA are going to delve in the next research volume on the issue of racism as like a specific fault line in our society that has traditionally, historically been very important and is newly re-challenged, I would say, in a way that it has long deserved. So I'll pass on the baton to Todd or whoever contributor might want to say a few words.
Thanks, Toby. Yeah, a couple of quick remarks, and thank you to the discussants for the fantastic comments. Really good, and unfortunately, don't have a ton of time to respond, so it'll be pretty brief. To Ginny's point on kind of the tensions between strengthening formal institutions versus the more radical organizing from below, I think you kind of hinted a little bit at what our thinking was in this, is that, it's a matter, power is at the foundation of this, right? For those that have power, they already have a seat at the table, so the formal institutions are working. For those that lack power, they're not included in the formal institutions and not able to exercise voice in that way. And as we've seen, declining unionization and really, industrial relations as a functional system applying to fewer and fewer and fewer workers as time goes on, that more militant activism is a way to bring more workers into a formal process, whatever that may look like. It may not be the recreation of the New Deal or the National Labor Relations Act. It could be something yet unimagined, but some formalized mechanism for people to have voice is generally, requires the activism like we saw in the 30s and in various periods throughout history of collective action. So thank you for that comment. Also, just to Martin's, I guess there was the point about us being decidedly normative, and that was something that Toby and I talked about a lot initially, of really wanting to be explicit about that up front, because speaking just from myself, I think that almost all research is normative in some fashion, and it's, it is or is not explicitly stated, but there are assumptions built into all disciplines, and labor studies is a very interdisciplinary field. And we wanted to kind of lay out front that, the position we're taking is bringing forth the work of the voice of workers and centering that. And we wanted to be very explicit about that. And I think that's definitely a good point you make, and it's one worth debating. And it's also probably one that's as old as academics is in general. So it's to be continued, I think. And also just real quick on the point, because you did raise my chapter about the just transition research. If it's okay with you, I will send you a copy of the Just Transition Listening Project. We just issued the report about a month ago. And to your point about there being like in whose interest, that was really the goal of the listening is to find out what the different interests are and try and figure out where there is common ground and ways to help build, the alliances and coalitions to, serve the greater good of all and deal with those distributional conflicts in a way proactively by listening up front to what the various fears and concerns and experiences are of different segments of the working population. And I will leave it at that. Naomi?
You want to give space to Michelle or Saul if they want to jump in and say something? Still have a minute.
I would just say on the question of, I think it's important to be explicit about the normative roles, because I think if they're there no matter what on some level, I think in the work that we do, oftentimes the norms people would probably critique, could critique the norms no matter which way you go, and it depends on where the balance is. I mean, sometimes in the field of skill development, people would look at the kind of predominant debate in the national policy arena and say that is normatively balanced towards employers more so than workers. And I think that we just being explicit about whose interests are at play in any policy agenda or research agenda is important, because if we don't say it, sometimes it's there anyway. We just haven't recognized it.
Last word to you, Saul.
Well, I have a minute, and so all I'll say is that I had originally done work in the private sector, particularly in the auto industry, and was very frustrated to find that the kinds of changes we were looking at could be undone by a corporate board who didn't want to share power. And what has come to me in looking at public education in particular is how important the grassroots are of the electorate electing a board who then selects a superintendent, who then decides, is this something that they want to do or not? And so for me, in this sector in particular, it's both institutional, but it's also grassroots. And the way power plays out in that, and the way democracy plays out in there, is something that I want to explore in further work, but I found it to be really interesting and really rewarding.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody.
I guess time is up. Thanks everybody for showing up. I appreciate it. And we look forward to talking with you more about the book.
Yeah,
That's great.
thank you very much. It was way
Thanks
too
for having
short.
us.
Thank you all. Really enjoyed it.
Thought I have
Martin,
to copy
I left
the
the
link
link there
before
for you,
the
Martin.
session closes.
Enjoy your glass of wine, Martin.
Yeah,
I'll see you in Berlin.
yeah, looking forward, hey? So,
And I'll stay here so you can save the chat. Anybody who wants to save it.
yeah.
Thank you guys for
Naomi.
putting this together.
An
Yeah.
hour goes by so quickly.
Too short.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
really
we
think-
should have, so I should maybe say this. I mean, it's not part of the panel, I guess. We
So Todd,
should,
go
we
ahead
will
and
have a
stop
book
recording.
launch event.
I'm going to stop recording. Yes. Good call.